So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good evening, or whatever good it is, the time of day where you are. I am going to give now my third out of four lectures on direct democracy. And as in the previous lectures, we will be talking about a number of issues, but most of them dealing with issues pertaining to referendums. Now, in the first two lectures, we have prepared the ground, as it were, by looking at the history of direct democracy and referendums. We have looked at the distinction that we have between plebiscites, which are votes that are held in dictatorships, and we will have more to say about this in the fourth lecture, which is coming after this one. And we will have also talked about referendums, which come in two types. Ones that are sort of have a plebiscitary nature, which come from above, and then we have the ones that come from below, typically the types of votes that you have in Italy, where people can demand a referendum on any existing law, or the ones that you have in Switzerland, where people, or the people, or a percentage thereof, can demand that the referendum is held before a law passed by the Parliament becomes law, or an act passed by Parliament becomes law, I should say, more properly. Now, today we're going to talk about something which is slightly odd, and it does revolve around Switzerland, because Switzerland, in many ways, is a country which is a little bit odd. The Swiss themselves talk about Sonderland, Sonderfallschweiz, Sonderfallschweiz. It's difficult to say if you're not German, and it basically means special case Switzerland, sui generis Switzerland, and that Switzerland is in some ways a very rare example of democracy, as indeed it is, because Switzerland has had half the referendums in human history have taken place in Switzerland. But Switzerland is also interesting in another way. It is not quite so odd, because Switzerland is what we call a consociational democracy. And here's a book that I edited with my colleagues, Duro and Michelina, and it was written for and had contributions by a great man called Aaron Leipart, whom we should also talk about today. And Aaron Leipart has written several books that in some ways pertain to Switzerland. I'm using this one because it basically says in the title what it's all about: democracy in plural societies. Now, that is, in a way, what is so interesting about Switzerland, because Switzerland, unlike, say, Norway, is not a monocultural state. In Switzerland, there are people who are Calvinists, they tend to live around Geneva. Then there are people who are Catholics, who tend to live in the northern part of the country. There are people who speak Italian, there are people who speak Retro-Romanish, there are people who speak German, and there are people who speak French. Now, what is interesting about Switzerland, and they did have a war about this in the 1840s, the Sonderbund War, was that all these different people, or groups or types of Swiss people, have been able to live together. And in Switzerland, they have found a way of establishing what, to use another one of Leipart's book, establish a politics of accommodation. And when you have this politics of accommodation, then you find it possible for people who are completely different to actually live peacefully together, and also to make a success of that particular country. And it is in the context of this system that we will be looking towards the end of the lecture at Swiss direct democracy and see how these two types of systems are compatible. But the problem in political science and in sociology and in many other endeavors is, how do people who are very different live together? When at the time of the French Revolution we had new states that emerged, then it was taken as a given that the ethnos, the ethnic group of the people, was the same as the demos, the people as citizens. So people as individuals from an ethnic group, and people as citizens from a demos should be congruent. So basically, to be Swedish, to take one example, was to be part of an ethnic group called Swedish, and that was to be Swedish was also to be a part of the Swedish demos was also be part of the Swedish ethnos. So there was no differences there. Now, if you just move to a country to the east of Sweden, you have Finland, where a large proportion, about 10%, are not Finnish, are Swedish speakers. In Finland, therefore, you needed to have a system that could accommodate that. Now, there are different strategies that you can use when you have ethnically diverse societies. One way of having ethnically diverse societies, we should slightly come into that in the last lecture on plebiscites, is basically to force those who are different to fall into line. And you can basically talk about homogenizing strategies. You basically deny that there is such a thing as ethnic minorities, and you force them into adopting a common approach to life, a common philosophy, and you basically sort of weed out those differences. In France, it's been very much the case, and France is a democratic country, one of the countries with the longest democratic traditions. But in France, they've done a lot to make sure that people who are Corsicans or Bretons and so on are not able to pursue that. That in France, everybody is French. Everybody who believes in life, liberty, and equality is French. You have to be able to speak French as well. It used to be said in the metro in France, you're not allowed to speak Breton or spit on the floor. So in France, you have homogenized people. You force them to be French, and you try to weed out all those differences. To a degree, you tried that in America as well. It hasn't, as we know, presently really worked. Now, in other countries, and Switzerland is one of them, but in other countries where they have the system of consociationalism, it's a term that was used originally in the 17th century by a Dutch-German philosopher called Johannes Althusius. Consociationalism is basically the art of finding institutions that enable people to live together. Traditionally, it's been the case that people who live in multi-ethnic states, just such as France, such as to a degree Britain, of course we have the Scots, we have the Welsh, we have the Irish, that they would just fall into line and the majority culture would dominate and people would then have to assimilate into that particular culture. Now, when you assimilate into a particular culture, you also lose all the flavorings that you have. You go from having a pizza culture to having a culture which is basically a melting pot, and of course in America that's seen as a thing to aspire to. But in the Netherlands, if we take that example first, we'll come to Switzerland later. In the Netherlands, they have the same problem that we in Britain have had in Northern Ireland. Now, in Northern Ireland, the majority, at least until very recently, was Protestant, and they wanted to be close to the United Kingdom, so they were Unionists, and the majority also tended to be middle class. So we did not have overlapping cleavages, as it's called in political science. We had basically two types of people. You had Catholics who tended to be working class, who tended to be Irish nationalists, and who, of course, tended to be of the Roman Catholic religion. And on the other side, you had Protestants that tended to have be of a Calvinist tradition, or some of them also Church of England. They were Unionist, and they tended to be middle class. Now, the latter were in complete control, and of course that started the troubles in Northern Ireland. The thing that was then tried in Northern Ireland that we have now is a system of power sharing. It's a system whereby people from different groups are allowed to have those differences. And that system was explicitly modelled on the Netherlands, modelled on the work of Aaron Leipart. And Aaron Leipart, I should say, who wrote this very famous book, The Politics of Accommodation, also contributed to the anthology that we published at Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. In fact, Aaron Leipart is an honorary fellow at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and he is one of the world's absolutely foremost political scientists, probably of all times. He won the Johan Skytte Prize, which is the political equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Now, in his book, Aaron Leipart talks about the Netherlands, Now, we tend to think of the Netherlands as a place that have, an interesting nightlife, I think we can say. We also know that in the Netherlands there are people who are very religious. We think of that as a very stable society. We think of it as a rich society. But one of the things that characterizes the Netherlands is that the Netherlands is also a multicultural state in the same way, in literally the same way as Northern Ireland. In the Netherlands, there is a majority, traditionally there was a majority of people who identified with the Protestant religion, with Calvinism. There was a minority that identified with Catholicism, and there was a battle between those. And the Protestants were in control. The House of Orange, we know, of course, the Orange Order here in Britain. William of Orange was the man who came over here. The Protestant family was in control. Now, in the Netherlands, they realized that they, in order to live together, had to find a system that would work. The Netherlands were threatened by the North Sea, so they had to build fortifications so that they would not literally be flooded. But they also, from the east, were threatened by possible German interventions or invasions, and from the south they could be threatened by France. So they had two things in common that were of existential importance to them, namely foreign policy and, for want of a better word, environmental policies. So they needed to find a way of working together on those issues while also accepting that they were different. They had to accept that the Catholics would never become Protestants, or vice versa. So what they came up with in the Netherlands was a system of what they call verzouwling. And that basically means pillarization. Zaul is and I'm not pronouncing this correctly, is a pillar in Dutch. And each of the zoulen then would then stand for one of the cultures in this particular country. So if you were a Catholic, and Leipart describes it very well in the Politics of Accommodation, you would basically live your whole life within that particular pillar. You would go to a Catholic nursery, you go to a Catholic school, you go to a Catholic university, and you might work then in one of the Catholic cooperatives before you would be buried in a Catholic cemetery by a Catholic priest. Now, if you were Protestant, it would be exactly the same. You would be able to live your whole life within this particular pillar. And what they did in the Netherlands was they said, well, we will accept that each of the pillars can determine their own affairs as they like, but there are things we need to work together on, and that is such matters as foreign policy and defense policy, environmental policy, and also we need to have a framework for that, so we need to have a common finance policy. So in the government, it was accepted that all the political parties should work together for practical purposes. So you typically have a grand coalition of all the different parties working together very pragmatically on these matters that were seen to be of national importance, whereas you would delegate the issues that were of, if you like, sectoral importance to the various communities. So in this way, in the Netherlands, you were able to have groups working together who were very suspicious of one another, but they saw an interest in working together. Now, what Leipart did after he'd written the book, The Politics of Accommodation, which is a pure case study of the Netherlands, where he talks about the development of this particular model and how consociationism developed, was that he tried to look for this system elsewhere. He said, well, it's not just in the Netherlands that you have a system where people who are very, very different will have to work together. I mentioned before Finland, though Finland is probably not exactly a consociational box because the number of Swedes is relatively small. So what he did in his second book, there were a couple of anthologies in between, but his second major book, if you like, Politics or Democracy in Plural Societies, a comparative exploration, is that he looks at other countries where people who are very, very different have found ways of living peacefully together. And peacefully is the important thing. The problem in many societies is that we don't have peace. People are fighting with each other. And in these consociational democracies, they found ways in which they can work together. So he found that, for example, in the Lebanon, they had a system where the people who were very, very different would actually be able to work together. There would be Muslims, there would be Jews, there would be Christians, and they would, like in the Netherlands, and whether it was inspired by that or not, I think it sort of leaves open. They would be able to work together in order to protect themselves from what they saw as major threats, for example, the Syrians. So in the Lebanon, there was also a system of power sharing. You had the same system of power sharing in a place like, to a degree, in Canada, where the French and the English speakers were able to work together, irrespective of their very profound differences in many ways, both religiously. The Catholics the French tend to be Catholics, and the English speakers tend not to be Catholics. Yet they were able to work together because they'd had an interest in that. So Leipart was able to show that there are a number of countries that have all these characteristics of consociationalism, the characteristics of being able to work together. Now, what are those characteristics of being able to work together? What are the characteristics of consociationalism? The first characteristic is that you have a system of proportional representation. You have a system that allows all the major groups to be represented and therefore get a voice in government. Now, you have that in a number of other, what Leipart calls consensus democracies, like Sweden and Norway, to a degree Germany and Austria. That Austria was, in some ways, moving towards a consociational system. You have that in those countries, and there's no guarantee that they will work together. They will have to work together to establish a budget or get a budget through and so on. But the characteristic thing about consociationalism is that those different political parties also form a government, a unity government, where many parties that are very different work together. You have sometimes a collegiate executive. You've had that in city governments around the world. For example, in Denmark, they have a system of magistrates government, they call it. For example, in Copenhagen, so that always the city is governed by many political parties in a joint executive, where the Conservatives, the Liberals, the Socialists, and the Green Party are always together in a kind of coalition. Now, that's also what they have in Switzerland. We'll come back to Switzerland a little bit later. And this system has been exported to places where they had differences in society, whether political, ethnic, religious, or so forth. In Uruguay, which is arguably the most successful economically at least, most successful country in Latin America, in the first or second decades of the 20th century, they established a consociational system there. They also had one for a while in Colombia, because there were so many different groups, and therefore they established, first of all, through proportional representation, then through a system of a permanent coalition government of the major parties, this collective or collegiate executive. So those two things are the ones that at the political level characterize consociationalism. But the most important thing about consociationalism is that they then support different groups to live in the different Säulen, as they say in the Netherlands, the different pillars. And so that we have a system where you accept diversity, and in some ways you almost encourage that. You realize that the people cannot be made alike. You accept that they can live in different subcultures. In the Netherlands, you can, from one moment still, you have groups that are very, very Calvinist, so women are not allowed to wear trousers because they're so conservative religiously. And then you travel 30 miles and you get into the centre of Amsterdam, where the story, as you might know, is very, very different. And yet the Dutch, all of them, whether they live in Amsterdam or in the countryside, will defend this system because they say, we allow this diversity. We are proud of having, if you like, a pizza culture, whether they may not use this particular word. So in Uruguay, they also had this collective executive. They had proportional representation, and they had the pillars, like they did in the Netherlands, like they did in Lebanon, like they did in Malaysia for a while, and as they do indeed in Switzerland, which is what we now come to. Because one of the things about the consociational system is that it allows the elites to work together. Now, elite is, of course, a slightly tricky word. Of course, we know in Britain that certain politicians say we've had just about enough of experts. But in my book, The Referendum and Other Essays on Constitutional Politics, I look at consociational democracies and direct democracy. And the problem about direct democracy and consociational democracy is that they're almost it's sort of like they're poles apart. They never the twain shall really meet, one would have thought. Because in a consociational democracy, everything is organized by those people who are the elites of either the Protestant groups or the Catholic group, or whichever the groups may be, the Christian groups in the Lebanon and the Muslim groups and the Jewish groups in the Lebanon. They all work together, and then they make the decisions, and their communities just have to accept that. Now, Switzerland is different in that regard, and it's different because in Switzerland, uniquely, they have the referendum. Now, the referendum, in some ways, we will know this from Britain, where, very sadly, somebody got killed in the last referendum we had. It was said that not a single shot was fired. Well, shots were fired. There was violence both before, during, and after the Brexit referendum. So in many ways, referendums can be very, very toxic because they lead to this polarization in society. Now, in Switzerland, it's slightly different because in Switzerland, if we can just take that, we should marry the two concepts then a little bit later. In Switzerland, you have many more referendums. You don't really build up that level of steam or anger because if you have up to 16 referendums a year, typically they vote 4 times a year on several issues. So you don't really have a system that allows people to get that angry. But what you have in Switzerland is, and you've had this since 1958, you had a permanent coalition government between the People's Party, a Liberal Party, and also a Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party in Switzerland is a party on the left, and the People's Party is a party which would be on the very right wing of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. Like in some ways, it is a paradox that they can even coexist. And just like it's almost a paradox that we can have in Northern Ireland members of Sinn Féin, a Republican party that wants to unite Ireland, and the Ulster, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is a party which is rooted in Calvinist religion, which is very unionist and opposes pretty much everything that Sinn Féin stands for. But in Northern Ireland, they have been, in most cases, able to work together. But in some cases, it has broken down. The system of power sharing has broken down because the differences are just too enormous. And it's difficult to be in government and say, well, we're doing this for our communities. Now, in Switzerland, they've found a way in which they can, if you like, combine the virtues of power sharing with a political logic, namely that logic of what political scientists and political consultants indeed call solidifying the base. Now, having a political party means that you claim to represent a particular group in society. It may not be an ethnic group or a political group, it might be people who have that particular viewpoint. Now, in Switzerland, there are people who are very skeptical of immigration, who tend to have economically conservative views. They would tend to have the views that traditionally were known as petit bourgeois in French. In other words, have views that were sort of on the small shopkeepers' views that we should have low levels of taxation and so on and so forth. The Swiss People's Party very much represents that constituency. They also accept the idea that Switzerland is very diverse. They accept the fact that they cannot speak for the people. That's one of the problems you have in other countries where populists say, I speak for the people, and then you get 43% of the vote, and the remaining 56% are then, I guess, not the people. So in Switzerland, the People's Party, despite their name, accept that they represent a constituency, a part of the for the Swiss demos. So they have sometimes, they often have to accept things in government. They might be opposed to it. For example, in Switzerland, there are high levels of immigration. Up to 20% of the population has been estimated are born outside Switzerland. So Switzerland is not, in addition to having all these different ethnic groups beforehand, it is also a country that has many immigrants. Now, the Swiss People's Party is very much against it. So they have used the mechanism that there is in the Swiss constitution for demanding referendums on laws that have been enacted by Parliament. So a law will be enacted by Parliament, say on immigration, say on dual citizenship or something like that. The Swiss People's Party then being a responsible party in government would accept that, go through the system, because there is a majority in parliament for that, then they will, through the mechanisms of direct democracy, qualify a referendum. And that referendum on this particular issue will then take place. And they are then able to politically have their cake and eat it. They can campaign in the referendum for this particular policy, and then they can say, well, we stood up for this, we are representing our base, we are solidifying our base, but at the same time we are a responsible party. So typically there have been, and in the past there have been, I think on last count, 11 referendums on direct issues to do with immigration, and only one or two of them have passed. It depends on how we measure them. Now, typically in these referendums on immigration issues, the Swiss people overwhelmingly have voted for, if you like, a more multicultural, multi-ethnic society. There have been exceptions to that. For example, when they banned the minarets in a referendum, which some people considered to be an affront. It might well be, but it was in this particular case the view of the Swiss people, and in other places, of course, they have had similar views. If you take, for example, Denmark, it is forbidden to call for prayer, for Muslims to call for prayer, and there has not been a referendum on that. But in Switzerland, there has been referendums on a number of these issues, and in most cases, they have lost out. So in Switzerland, the beauty of the system there is that it allows people to enjoy the benefits of power sharing, but it also allows the political parties to dissent from the party line through referendums. And in that way, it is probably not surprising, or it may not be surprising, that Switzerland is the richest and, according to the Better Place Index, the best governed country in the world. Thank you.